Good evening, everybody. A big welcome to this LIDW session on mediation. The heading for our session is Stepping Back from the Brink, Turning from Dispute to Settlement. And I wanted, just as a bit of background, to explain that in this session, we wanted to consider something slightly different from the normal topics when one has a session on mediation. We want to look at what's going on behind the scenes, the psychological aspects of a mediation, which we as lawyers are aware of, but I think we could do with knowing a bit more about. Before we get into the session, just the usual bit of admin. Obviously, everyone will be very familiar with Zoom. We are on Zoom. And there is the chat function, which we'd like to use for this session, please. And we'd like to encourage you to post comments or questions, should you wish, on chat. And as we go through, we will try to pick up some of those comments and questions and interlace them into our discussion. We'll also try and leave a little time at the end for Q&A. The session's an hour. We've got a lot to get through. We've got a lot we want to share with you. So we better get on. Let me just introduce our speakers for this evening. First of all, we have Jim Handley, who's there in the check shirt. He's top left on my screen. Hi, Jim. Jim is a chartered occupational psychologist, and you can see we're going to start with him this evening. For many years, he's worked at the University of South Wales, where he set up and ran a consultancy unit and a degree course in applied psychology. He's worked on a wide variety of projects, from leadership development programs on negotiation, organizational culture and conflict, to helping nuclear plant troubleshooters improve their diagnostic skills and the steel industry to reduce their carbon footprint. More recently, he's been working on resilience and well-being. Our second speaker, and this is in no particular order, is Bill Marsh, who will be very well known to you. He's top right. He is a mediator, a member of Independent Mediators. He's one of the UK's leading mediators, and he's actually won Mediator of the Year award twice. That's the Who's Who award. He's a solicitor by background, and he specializes in commercial mediation, and he has a very broad practice. Crucially for this evening, he has a very international practice. Next up is Carl Mackey, who also needs no introduction, I'm sure. He is bottom left, and he is the founder president of CEDA. He's also a lawyer, a barrister actually, but, and this is where it gets interesting, he's also an occupational psychologist. He too has a broad commercial practice, like Bill. And lastly is Rebecca, who's in the middle of my screen. She's a member of IPOS Mediation, also a solicitor. She was a very senior litigation counsel for a bank. Now she's a full-time mediator, of course, and she's deputy chair of the UK Civil Mediation Council. Also a commercial mediator. She's actually, I noticed, she's widely praised for her Zoom skills in relation to mediation. And lastly, there's me. I'm Adrian Lively. I was a partner at Osborne Clarke for 25 years. I've now finished with that, and I'm now a full-time independent arbitrator and mediator, and my practice is called ADR Lively. Last thing, we are wondering who's in the audience. We're wondering what your background is, what your interest is in mediation. It would be useful for us to know a little bit about that in order to pitch our comments as we go along. So we are going to attempt a poll, which has now just come up on my screen. It's really simple. It's anonymous. If you could quickly fill that in, I'm told it will only be there for 2 minutes, and we'll publish the results of it, which is kind of a profile of the audience. Thank you. So to get to the meat of this evening's session, as I said, we're going to start with Jim. who's going to make some introductory remarks. And the idea is that once he's done that, we'll open it up to a discussion amongst the panel, and we'll see what they make of Jim's remarks, and we'll hopefully hear from these very experienced mediators what they've seen in practice. Jim, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Adrian. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I hope you've had a very fruitful time at the conference. And even though we're in an evening session, I hope we can make it interesting for you. Work should be an enriching, enjoyable, and meaningful experience. However, being involved in disputes can be very challenging. I'd like to discuss some ideas that can help us stay on top of our game and maintain our well-being. One of the most useful things that we can do is to actively develop a repertoire or a toolkit of knowledge, skills, and strategies. So I'm going to talk about some things that I found useful. Please feel free to pick and mix, try them out, see if they're useful for you. Excuse me, I've just there. Understanding basic human motivations is important, but don't worry, we're not going near Maslow's hierarchy of needs. First, there's an important distinction to be made between what are known as approach motivations and avoid motivations. There are things we want to get and things we want to prevent. There are several psychological needs we all seem to be pursuing in our lives. Getting these and removing barriers to them is at the heart of motivation. When any are threatened or blocked, we can get frustrated, upset, and angry, which can lead to all kinds of conflict and disputes. The most important of these are as follows: to be able to experience positive emotions, pleasure, satisfaction, gratitude, contentment, hope, and so on. Being able to immerse ourselves in engaging experiences, enjoying satisfying and nurturing relationships, feeling a sense of meaning and purpose, making progress towards our own personal goals, and a sense of autonomy, having some control over our lives and our ability to make choices. Much of the modeling of negotiation is based on game theory, with assumptions of rational, self-interested agents with stable preferences. However, although people certainly can think and behave in a rational manner, we don't always do so. There are predictable biases in thinking which can quickly undermine even the best designed mediations and negotiations. Some of these have been made famous in Daniel Kahneman's best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The basic premise is that we all engage in two kinds of thinking: fast, automatic thought, over which we have little control, and slower, conscious reasoning. For example, if I ask you not to think of a white bear for the next 10 seconds. I've primed your mind and activated that thought. It's very difficult not to. This fast automatic mode of thought is the basis of these biases. Most people are aware of anchoring and adjustment, in which an initial position serves as a reference point or baseline from which adjustments are subsequently made. It needs to be used prudently in negotiation and mediation, as making an extremely low opening offer can be counterproductive and elicit an overly high response, polarizing the situation with a wider gulf to bridge. Some other biases in decision-making are that we are generally loss averse. Losses loom far larger than gains. The focusing illusion, which is that nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you're actually thinking about it. There's also a strong tendency to interpret our own and other people's behavior in radically different ways. We tend to blame others' failures on things within them, bad intentions, personality traits, and so on, but excuse our own failures as due to circumstances and situations. For example, if I dent the car, it's because there was poor lighting and bad road conditions. If you dent the car, it's because you were careless. These attributions of blame happen automatically, and we tend to see them as facts of the matter rather than subjective interpretations. Another mental glitch involves sunk costs. Once we've made an investment, we're loath to relinquish it. This can be the reason people keep an old car beyond the point where it's rational to get rid of it, or stay in a relationship or job past the point it's good for them, or remain stubbornly entrenched in a particular position in a dispute. These are just a few of the large catalogue of biases that affect decision-making. Additionally, there are cultural differences, tacit assumptions and norms, which those experienced in international disputes will be all too familiar with. In order to function well, we need to maintain our psychological well-being. We might face long hours, heavy workloads, challenging expectations, emotional labor, and doing whatever it takes to get the job done. It's not difficult then for productivity to suffer, to feel emotionally exhausted, as if we're not coping well, and to become disengaged and cynical. Think of it as similar to the advice they give us on an airplane. In the event of an emergency, make sure you put on your own oxygen mask first, so you'll be able to help others. Here are 6 things that can help. Clarify your values. What do you find meaningful? Why are you doing this? And what are your strengths? What are the things that you're good at? Actively look for ways you can express these strengths daily. Decide on meaningful goals, a year, 5 years, and so on. Plan to move forward towards them and take action. Work on and maintain good relationships. Social support is one of the best buffers for stress. Find ways to get more autonomy and control in your life. Get more pleasure and positive emotion into your life every day. Savor and enjoy things. Schedule frequent small uplifts in your diary. And launch yourself into the thing in front of you with 100% absorption. Get into that flow state often. There are limits to focused attention. Multitasking generally does more harm than good, both for productivity and well-being. Objective facts can be interpreted in many different ways. We make sense of the world through our own concepts. We have certain expectations of how the story goes. In our own story, we are the hero and the other is the villain. We have a strong innate motivation to maintain our own sense of self as good or in the right, and selectively notice, remember, and reason with the facts that protect and defend our sense of self. We have a tendency to frame our thinking in metaphors, which automatically elicit implications. This firm is a well-oiled machine, for instance, generates the automatic implication that people are replaceable cogs, subservient to the whole, with little room for initiative and creativity. So trying to understand what frames participants in a dispute are using can be very useful. Is this a battleground, a poker table, or a dance floor? This affects the whole process, but these can be changed. We've all had the experience of changing our viewpoint on an issue and perhaps said something like, I hadn't thought of it that way before, but now you put it that way. There are various models and designs of mediation and negotiation with some common features. Dual concerns models can be useful to understand participants' attitudes, collaborating or competing and so on. They provide a framework to analyze what's going on and can help us to select appropriate responses. At a general level, there are common themes. Planning and preparation might involve establishing the facts, trying to understand positions and interests, setting objectives, preparing concessions in advance, and so on. And then in discussion, looking for overlapping interests, generating options, and looking for win-win settlements. But as the military strategists say, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Things don't always go according to plan and can require specialized communication skills. I assume that many here are very familiar with Robert Cialdini's work on influence. He proposed that there are only 6 psychological principles of persuasion, and that these operate by producing automatic emotional responses. These are reciprocation, commitment and consistency, social norms, liking, authority, and scarcity. It's useful to understand and recognize these when they're used on us and to be proficient in using them ourselves. However, more recently, he's argued for the critical importance of something he calls persuasion, or getting people to be receptive to our message before they hear it. This is built on the idea of directing attention and interest. He points to hardwired attention grabbers, which are well known to the persuasive industries, which we can use to good advantage. Priming an appropriate frame immediately before you propose a relevant offer changes the way that offer is seen and evaluated. For example, in a contentious, bitter divorce where each party is hell-bent on hurting the other, you might change the frame to focus on common values, perhaps reminding them that whatever has happened between them, they will always be their children's parents and will both need to be there and be cordial for weddings and major life events. For the children's sake, they need to work this out. This kind of frame change can shift the discussions radically. However, this needs to take place before the substance of the dispute is discussed. Where we focus our attention changes who we are in that moment. I'd like to just touch briefly on communication skills. There's an ongoing risk for all of us of eating the skin and throwing away the orange with communication skills and just going through the motions. This is particularly true for active listening. It isn't enough for us to understand what someone's telling us. They must feel genuinely understood and validated. Otherwise, people can get stuck in an endless repeat and replay loop. And finally, building trust can be the turning point to open up productive discussion. The perception of 3 characteristics seems to be necessary for trust: competence, consistency, and caring. And of course, the best way for us to acquire trust is to deserve it with our integrity, competence, and genuine care. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was a lot of information. And I'm sure that us lawyers are working hard to understand it all. And I hope through the rest of the session, we will get a better understanding of how this plays out in a mediation. So I think that was really helpful. To try and break this down a little, can we perhaps start by looking at this whole area of the human psychology of motivation and what people want, what interests are, and how they might be different. And I think perhaps we could ask Carl, would you mind kicking off that and giving us your reactions to what you've just heard?
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Jim, for, I have to say, an excellent canter through many of the elements of psychology. I was reminded when I first started mediator training at CEDAR many years ago, I was approached by a Swedish psychologist who was researching the field and said to me, well, what model of psychology are you basing the mediation training on? And it really made me think hard, because I realized actually we had a very pragmatic model. It was very process-based. There was a structure there about how do you help people have a better dialogue, which was make sure you do adequate preparation, make sure people have an opportunity to have a bit of theatre at the beginning in terms of an opening session for explaining what their feelings were. Explore that in a great deal of depth, because by doing so, you'll find out their interests and where they're coming from and what they need. And then if the process is going well, and you should be ensuring that it does go well, of course, as part of your active professional role, how do they move into bargaining and getting to some kind of realistic framework for exiting from a disturbing situation, which is the normal situation with litigation. And if it goes well, of course, then there's concluding and drafting a settlement. So you have a pragmatic process and it acts as a framework, but it took me a little longer to realize that actually there's an element of psychology which Jim just touched very briefly on, but I think is a really core thing for us to consider, and why mediation is so successful. Because you have to say to yourself, many of these mediations are about cases where people have been working for years, negotiating them, investigating them. They don't settle them, they come to a mediation, and hey presto, in a day, 70% plus of those difficult, deadlocked impasses settle or get close to settlement, enough close to that they can move on to settlement quite quickly after the day. And I think the reason is the science of attention in psychology. We don't appreciate how much our lives are guided by what we attend to. And there's quite a lot of research, and that's a very famous experiment involving a basketball game and a gorilla, where people are asked to attend to the number of passes in the basketball game. In the middle of the video, a gorilla appears and beats its chest and then moves off again. But because you've asked people to attend to the number of passes, suddenly they haven't seen the gorilla, and they're amazed that they never saw the gorilla when you repeat the film for them. So what mediation does, I think, is help people focus their attention on settlement for the first time. In litigation, you focus on strength of case, liability, quantum. There's a lot of work advisors do to make sure that they're really supporting the client. But in mediation, you get external assistance to try to pull things together and get a deeper understanding. We were asked to come up with some, a couple of war stories or case histories, and I remember some very well in this context in terms of attention, but also stress and distress. I mediated a case with 4 directors who ran a used car showroom, and there was this case of unfair prejudice between shareholders and directors. What the 4th director was suing the other 3. We got to the stage of the mediation. I was asking for their best offers to put to the 4th director, and I got into a personal conversation with the 3 directors who were defendants, and what they said was, actually, our lives have been ruined by this litigation. It's dominated our lives. All 3 of our marriages have broken up. It was a terrible, landscape of distress on that business. And then I went back to the 4th director with an offer, and I said, "Here's the offer, but it's your decision as to how you approach this." And I said that it's your decision. I was deliberately creating a nuanced communication because I knew the legal team would be disappointed in the offer. So I was saying to the director, it's your decision. And he turned to me and he said, "Actually, Carl, it's not my decision. My wife has been so upset by this case that I promised her before coming into mediation, she would be the decision maker. And if I got an offer that was above a certain amount, I would call her up immediately and she would take the decision." So that's what he did. He got his mobile out. He called his wife and spoke to her briefly, said what the amount on offer was, and hey presto, the matter had settled just at that point. So really understanding what's driving people is a big part of the psychology of the effectiveness of mediation. But I should stop there and pass to Bill and Rebecca for their comments on this as well.
Yeah, let me come in here, Carl, and thank you both for that. 2 points really. One is about capacity and the other is about assumed motivation. The capacity point has to do with the effect on people of being in a prolonged fight of whatever kind, and therefore the capacity they have for good decision making. I'll touch in some of my remarks later on the fact that I think that very much of the focus of every mediation actually is on good decision making. But when you have people who are in many ways brutalized by years of whatever it is, their capacity to make good decisions is often quite diminished. And that tends in many cases to lead to a default towards ultra defensiveness. You see it more, well, I suppose the more brutal the context, the more you see it. But certainly there are real concerns, for example, in the international peace community about the capacity of some rebel groups to make any kind of meaningful decisions in a mediation context about peace, because many of them have been child soldiers since the age of 5. And therefore their genuine capacity to look at a situation and make decisions is highly limited. Now, I don't want to compare most litigants to child soldiers, but it's only a question of degree. And all of us who are mediators, and many on this call as well, will have met people whose capacity to make good decisions is challenged by the brutality of what they've been through. And so I think, coming back to your case, Carl, of the 4 directors in a second-hand car business, sometimes people need to hear that it's been brutal for the other lot too, not necessarily because of a sense of glee at knowing that, although it might be that, but often because they need to appreciate that everybody is trying to make difficult decisions in very difficult circumstances. The other point I wanted to pick up on was what I call assumed motivation. And Jim, you touched on this as well in your remarks, that when people do something, we ascribe to them a certain motivation for it, which is often entirely false. And again, those of us who are mediators see this the whole time in mediations. If somebody takes a long time to make an offer, it is assumed that in some way they're underprepared or in chaos or whatever. If one party doesn't want to make disclosure of a certain point, it is assumed that there is a malicious or other negative intention behind it. So again, this question of the people who present, I suppose it is, who presents to us in mediation. And it's, I think, very incumbent on mediators to be recognizing that if we want people to make good decisions, it may take them time to emerge from some of the brutality in order to make those good decisions. Let me hand on to Rebecca.
Thank you, Bill, Carl and Jim. I guess I wanted to pick up on something Jim referred to in terms of Robert Cialdini's approaches to psychology, but also Carl's point about the importance of what we attend to, and Bill's point about what a difficult ask it can be for somebody to negotiate or change their position in a mediation. And one thing that's really helped me understand that is Robert Cialdini talks about these 6 universal principles, which he says are in play in any persuasion or negotiation. And as Jim said, these are automatic instinctive responses or shortcuts that we use to make decisions on a daily basis. And I think one that's particularly relevant to mediation is, and to disputes generally, is commitment and consistency. And I think what this principle says is that once we have made a decision or taken a stand, we feel very internally pressurized to behave consistently with the position that we've taken. And he refers to an experiment in America where there was an 18% reduction in missed appointments at a GP surgery simply by getting people to write the appointments down themselves on their own cards rather than handing the cards to them. And I think when you look at how litigation is run, certainly in the UK and in many different jurisdictions, we have a process where you articulate a dispute and you articulate the strongest points in your dispute. You write a letter before action, you might do a claim form, you might then put in a defense. Every time you ask somebody to articulate that position, their confidence in the rightness of that position increases. And interestingly, it's not just the party's confidence in the rightness of the position, but their legal representatives' confidence in the rightness of their client's position increases each time too. And even if you look at how sometimes mediations work in this country, people write what's called a mediation position paper. So even before you go into a mediation, again, people are sometimes encouraged to write a position paper, which can be often focusing on the strengths of their own case and the weaknesses in the other party's case. And from that position of wanting to be consistent, we're then suddenly expecting people to move away from that consistency and that polarization of opinions. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it generally. I'm going to hand back to Adrian or Jim.
Yeah, if I can just comment briefly now, I think that's absolutely right. And coming back to what Bill said as well about assuming what other people's intentions are. These kind of processes just happen like that. We don't think we're assuming. We just think that is the way it is. You did bang the car because you're careless. I banged the car because of the circumstances. That person's intent, and particularly if you've got a conflict, then we tend to project our fears, our insecurities, and attribute the worst motivations to them. And in a heated environment, it's very difficult to get people to stop and consider other alternatives. So I think what Bill was saying about people need space to, I don't know what you'd call it. It's not just to vent. It's not some kind of cathartic venting. It's much more complicated than that. And I'm not sure anybody really understands what's going on, but you can sense it. You can sense changes in people's attitude and changes in when they're more open. There's a certain point where people become more open to considering a different point of view. But I think these things do happen very fast and very automatically.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. If we could just move on to another aspect, please, just as important. Before doing so, I think one thing that strikes me is that, and maybe this is because I was counsel for so many years for parties at mediations, is that when you come into the mediation room, you are entering a different world, because you've exited the world of litigation where you're trying to prove fact, and you think fact is fairly fixed, and it's what can be proven on the documents or the oral evidence. And you go into a world where, and we've just heard about this, truth is somewhat flexible. It's very flexible, actually. Maybe it's not even the right thing to be looking at. It's understanding what the other people in the room are thinking. It's understanding their viewpoints and their motivations. And with your car crash analogy, it doesn't really matter who was to blame for the dent in the car. Other things matter more when you get into the mediation room. And I think that's what I would like to come on to, please, because the title of this session is Turning from Dispute to Settlement. And one needs to change the narrative. One needs to address these different perspectives if you're going to reach a settlement. And I wanted, if I may, to ask Bill to comment on that, please.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Happily. So this is really about, I suppose, trying to move from fixed and opposing or differing points of view to at least something else. And we might come on to what something else is. I think in many ways, I would want to start by saying that parties, possibly rightly, have become skeptical of mediators. And I think the reason is that they think we're trying to talk them into something. And to be perfectly frank with you, if someone was trying to talk me into something, I wouldn't be that keen to participate. So the resistance doesn't surprise me. And I think it's in many ways because we've got used to framing the discussion or framing the description rather of the process in a way that's not terribly helpful. So the focus of discussions about mediation is often on settlement. It's often on compromise. It's often quite transactional and pragmatic. And in one sense, that's absolutely right, because that's an end game. But if you say that to someone who's not in that space at all, we shouldn't be terribly surprised if they're not interested. So I think other ways to frame it include, for me at least, first of all, that mediation is really a forum for making good decisions. And if we think about it in that context, then without engaging with your opposing parties, you don't know as much as you might know about what is a good decision. That completely reframes, I think, what's going on in a mediation from an assumption of compromise to an opportunity to explore and learn. Because the question of making good decisions really begs the question, what do you need to make a good decision? Well, the answer is you probably need as much information as possible. And that information may include how the other lot see it and what the other lot think about it, not just on paper, but how they choose to express it. So I think by not presuming agreement, perversely, we make the process much more accessible to people. I think the second area of reframe is that we focus too much. But by focusing on settlement, we challenge people's views of the past. And there is a kind of assumption, I think, that if you go to mediation, you have to agree on things. The reality, of course, of most mediations is people don't end up agreeing on very much, except possibly the outcome. And this is critically true where there are strong narratives, and those narratives have been bolstered. The narrative's usually a narrative of grievance. It's been bolstered by years and years of investment of time and money and effort and hatred and all the rest of it. And again, I've been working in Bosnia quite a lot over the last couple of years, where, as we'll know, the background of grievance is intense. If I turn up there and say to people, do you want to talk about agreeing on the past, I can get on the next plane home. It's a pointless exercise. So there is a shift, I think, that, and this is my next point really, that there's a gradual shift from history to risk that happens in a mediation process, not because people agree on the past, but because they have possibly to some extent the satisfaction of talking about it. And then they start to think, well, now, how do we actually move forward from here? And so they move into a discussion where the benchmark for settlement or for resolution is no longer, do I share your view of history? The benchmark for settlement is what's best for me going forward, given the different risks I have. So I think we need to be very careful, all of us, in the way we talk about mediation. We need to open up a much more serious space for disagreement. Now, all of this may sound very unpragmatic if you're a busy CEO and you want to come into a mediation and crack a deal and move on. And I get that. There are issues of degree and issues of context that we need to bear in mind. But I do want to encourage us away from these assumptions that settlement is attractive to everybody, particularly where it involves some form of acceptance of the past. Two other areas quickly with that context in mind. One is the value of joint discussions. Funnily enough, I was on a call this afternoon actually to one party about a mediation taking place tomorrow. And the first remark that the lead lawyer for this party, I hope he's not on this call, well, he's welcome if he is, but the first remark he made was, I haven't done a mediation in years where an opening session was of any value. My slightly tongue-in-cheek response to that was, well, I guess it depends what you do in these opening sessions. What I think is going on often is a protecting of one's view of the past. Because if you get it, for any of us in life, if we get exposed to other views, it's harder to hold on to them. And a bunker mentality, if you like, can be nurtured. And the best example I know of this, I wrote a blog on about 5 or 6 years ago, was the Syrian civil war peace talks that took place in Geneva. And you may, I don't know whether you know about them or whether you recall any of that, but the mediator was Lakhdar Brahimi, who was, I think, a former Tunisian or Algerian foreign minister. And he spent days and days trying to persuade the parties to meet together, and they refused resolutely. In the end, they did, but only in a context where they would speak to him rather than acknowledge the presence of the other. Afterwards, there was a press conference, and the Syrian press officer, despite the fact that they'd sat in the same room, said nothing to each other, only to the mediator, and not even addressed each other or acknowledged their presence. The Syrian press officer said it was impossible not to be affected by being in the same room. There was a kind of a sort of a tacit challenge by the exposure of one's presence and thinking to a different point of view. Now, again, it's a dramatic example. Syrian peace talks don't happen in most commercial mediations, but the point is still the same. And I'll race through the final point because I don't want to take up too much time. That's understanding the particular purpose of any discussion within a mediation. So when we put people together and say, have a discussion, more fool us, frankly, as mediators. We shouldn't be surprised if they default to something that's pretty defensive. Because most of us, in the context we operate in, we think that and I guess this is our sort of an assumption either from being in the legal profession or generally from Western philosophy, actually. We assume that the purpose of contested conversation is to persuade. And that's only one purpose. It could be to inform. It could be simply to establish that there is a legitimate alternative point of view. It could be to establish clarity. And if you give people a better purpose for that particular conversation, they're far more likely to deliver in accordance with it. So more fool us mediators if we just plonk people together and expect them to come up with the goods. I hope I haven't gone over my time, but let me hand over to one of my colleagues at this point.
Rebecca, did you want to say something?
Actually, I wanted to pick up on a few things that Bill just mentioned around mediations being an opportunity to explore and learn, and the value of a joint session and what that might be used for. And the best way I can do that is by way of an example of a mediation that I did about a year ago. And it was a mediation that had taken, I think, maybe 3 years to set up, which is a really long time. And it was a banking dispute where a retail bank had withdrawn banking facilities for a business. And this had on a random basis, and the bank agreed it was a random basis. There was no dispute as to factually what had happened. What the bank couldn't accept was the level of damage and the impact this had had on the business. And over the course of these years, the claimant, sometimes through lawyers and sometimes himself, had sent reams and reams of information to the bank, and couldn't understand why the bank wasn't engaging with him and wasn't taking him seriously. He was trying to persuade the bank as to the rightness of his position. And picking up again on something that Bill said, it's really interesting because we know now that the very act of persuasion can backfire. So when people feel that they are being persuaded, they actually become more entrenched in their own views. But we had a long discussion about what would happen at the mediation, and we had a joint meeting because it was clearly very important for the claimant to feel heard and understood, and he felt that the bank hadn't been reading this correspondence properly. And to be fair, I'm not sure it really had got into the meat of it. And it was a very interesting meeting because rather than trying to persuade the bank as to the rightness of his position, the claimant lay out the facts of what had happened, albeit as he saw them, but there was no persuasion, but there was a lot of emotion. And he spoke factually and he spoke from the heart, and at times got very distressed, as did his wife. And the representative from the bank and the bank's lawyers sat and listened to everything that the claimant said. They listened very carefully. They apologized. They asked questions. They engaged with him. And they actually admitted that they had had no idea of the impact that this had had on the business. And finally it was almost like the light bulb went on and they understood why this had been so devastating for the claimant. And actually in that case, as Bill has alluded, we didn't settle on the day because actually the parties were so far apart. The bank had come with a mandate to settle that the representative actually said, listen, I've come with a mandate. It's nowhere near enough. We just hadn't appreciated that all this had happened. We need to go away and get a new mandate. And it did settle shortly thereafter. But that to me is the most powerful example I've seen of how a joint session can be used in a way that it was just very honest and factual, and it really made a very significant difference in moving people forward. I guess I'm going to pass on to Carl.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, no, it's always fascinating actually hear from other practicing mediators as to how they frame their own narratives about mediation can be very different. And I suppose if I was giving advice to the legal advisors who are listening in, I know some have sent some questions in chat comments already. It is really about, you don't have to be a psychologist to do well in mediation, but I think you do have to have an interest in reading people and reading the subtleties of where they're coming from and the negotiation positions. And you need to be good at testing, you know, where there are pragmatic options and opportunities, as Bill was talking about as well. People often had a very deluded view of mediation, that it's about everyone wins and it comes out happy from the process, whereas the more typical outcome from a litigation context, I have to say, is we're losing, but we're happily losing because we feel equal pain, and that's what you know, that makes us satisfied that the brutality, as Bill was talking about, imposed on the other side and also on us, feels in some way equitable. And so the process is really to generate that sense of feeling. I suppose the other issue in narratives is really understanding the story as well for the mediator and for each side. Unless you really understand where people are coming from and how they want to frame things, they may not do so well. Occasionally I've been asked to coach in very big mediations. I've not been a mediator, but one of the parties has said to me, would you coach us in how we should, you know, do well in the mediation? And what I find people have most difficulty with is when I say to them, well, I'm hearing your model of the world, but I'm already seeing from what you've shown me, they have a different model. So can you do a presentation that comes from their model and speaks their language and understands their perspective, and then says, what do you really want? And people find that incredibly hard. They have lived with that case so much. They've gone over the arguments again and again in their own teams and management with the lawyers, that suddenly to break away from that is really traumatic. But it's actually incredibly powerful. And sometimes it's the mediator who brings that different perspective at the end, close to the end of the day. People do move to another perspective, or at least accept that's the reality of what they're dealing with out there. And they have to live with that reality and just go for the shoes that fit them, rather than worry about getting into the other party's shoes. And I was reminded strongly of that in a case I did a few years back now, because you realize that because it involved EU competition law. Some of you might even remember the EU. And it was a major car company. It was being accused of breach of competition law, sued for civil damages because it was infringing or prohibiting the sale of generic parts for its motor vehicles. And so I was dealing with a very big US team. They had the director of finance, director of intellectual property, director of engineering. They had the US general counsel came to the mediation. And it was an amazing case for learning different perspectives, because the US general counsel late in the day pulled me aside and said, look, the damages here are not really that significant to us. We're used to much bigger damages, stateside. He said, I really came over just to see how my legal team performed in their arguments with the mediator, and see what he just wanted to sit in and observe how his legal team did, and that would give him some clue as to where to go. But this company were taking ages. Every time I left them in private session, they would take a long, long time to come back to the trade association to say what the offer was. And I kept popping in the door, and I suddenly realized this is not a negotiation with the other side. What's going on here is the different departments have budgets, and it's a question of whose budget is going to take the hit for the outcome of this case. So it was a sudden real insight for me about your internal negotiation, and what a mediation was all about. Was really about who's going to pick up the tab at the end of the day. And knowing that actually did help me to have a more frank conversation about how they could frame their own offers. So it was a really powerful moment in negotiation. The other powerful moment, just to throw another piece of insight into people kind of very strange motives in counter mediation, only after the settlement, when the parties were drafting a settlement agreement, the person representing the trade association, it turned out he had bought the litigation from the trade association. He'd been a former director of the trade association, but his motive in the mediation was actually he got the proceeds from the settlement, and that did not emerge through the whole process. Now, you might wonder about the legality of all that, but at the time, things were too busy to raise these esoteric legal questions. But again, I think it demonstrates that the whole power of the process, and my co-speakers have set it out very well. There's a lot going on in mediation. It's one of the best ways of getting, as one mediator described it, an objective data set of what the real world of this conflict is all about. You don't get that data set in any other way, not from direct negotiation, not even in a trial, because the trial is about the legal issues, whereas mediation is about the holistic issues of the parties, the commercial realities, their personal realities, and what they can live with for that day in that moment. So it's an incredibly powerful focusing of minds.
Thank you, Carl. I think listening to this, whether one is a mediator or counsel or a client, one's bound to be thinking, well, what can I do to be better, to be more effective when I next get into a mediation? Some very thought-provoking insights we've already heard. We've heard how people spend way too much time at mediations trying to persuade the other party that they're right. And that's not necessarily the route to finding some resolution, some better decision, as Bill put it. So if we're going to do better next time, what skills do we need to be mindful of? In what way do we need to be more thoughtful about the mediation, both in preparation and during? I wonder if I could ask Rebecca to answer a rather difficult question, I'm afraid, but I think it's one that must be on our minds.
No, there's not one answer to that question, obviously. I think one thing that I'm often asked is how you draw people together, given that you do often arrive polarized. What's going on when people start to negotiate, and why do people get stuck in a negotiation? And I think one thing that's really helped me understand that is to look at why disputes arise, and I don't mean in terms of who's done what in breaching what contract or what piece of negligence, but people far more academic than I am have researched and discovered that self-esteem is one of the most motivating factors in all conflict in human existence. So, you know, on a small level in a contract dispute, and then some of Bill's more faith and type mediations, for instance. And people are very driven to maintain their own self-esteem. And, you know, we want to be approved of and thought well of by others. So whether that's your family or if your wife in the example came up earlier, or your employer or your board of directors. But we also want to feel good about ourselves. And it's not a concept that's limited to people. You know, companies can have self-esteem, even countries can have self-esteem. If you look at the boost of the 2012 Olympics on the UK. And self-esteem is eroded when people believe that they're being disrespected or treated unfairly. And I think we can be really dismissive when adults complain of things being unfair. You know, we're told, well, life's not fair, kind of suck it up. But it's an innate animal instinct. And I think bearing that in mind, I think one of the hardest things in a mediation is how you can help your counterparty exit or make a concession or come closer to you in a way that enables them to maintain their self-esteem. Because if you're going to encounter only shame or defeat if you back down, then you're really fighting against your innate instincts to settle. One of the, Jim talked in his speech about the use of metaphors, and I think one of the metaphors that really has resonated with me, both as a mediator and as a party who attended mediations when I was at the bank, is this concept of the Golden Bridge. And I'm sure some of you will have heard of this. It's Sun Tzu, who was a 4th century BC Chinese military strategist, who said, "A wise conquering general is one who builds a golden bridge upon which his defeated enemy can retreat." And I think that's really interesting. So if you're given a dignified exit route from a dispute, and you can exit in a way or compromise or make a concession in a way that enables you to maintain self-esteem, you're far more likely to do that. And you can hear that actually in the language that we use in mediation. So you might hear somebody say, "If only you disclosed this earlier, we wouldn't have done X, Y, Z," or "if only we'd known about this document." And it's actually giving somebody something they can latch onto to enable them to justify a change in position. That's a metaphor that's really helped me in trying to process what's going on in a negotiation.
Any other thoughts or comments from panelists, please?
Thank you. Perhaps just one or 2 points. It's interesting to think where we learn, or from where we learn our skills in handling conflict. And certainly if you look at contested conversations in the public sphere, they rely heavily on one-liners and on shame. And if you simply listen to for example, House of Commons debate, about every fourth utterance is a way of heaping shame. The right honourable gentleman can't possibly think, or if she lived in the real world, ... These are all deeply shaming comments. And so, and of course, we see a lot of that in that kind of language and approach in mediation, partly perhaps because we tend to learn our approach to conflict from what's gone on, at least in part, from what's gone on in the public space. And so I think just recognizing the impact of our language, our choice of language, and it does require recognition, because so often these things happen sub or semi-consciously. We do it because we've just got used to it. I remember having, by the time I'd been a mediator for about 10 years, I went to a mediation as a party, and the mediator, halfway through the day, brought in an offer that I thought was actually a really decent offer. And before I could stop myself, I said the kind of things that parties say to mediators all the time. I said something along the lines of, you don't seriously mean we've been here for 4 hours and that's the best thing. I can't remember what it was exactly, but it was something along those lines. And I caught myself saying it and heard myself saying it with a sense of, that's completely ridiculous. What are you talking about? And so I think even the act of making express the choice of language we use is a way of empowering people to choose something different, because most of these things are done too much by instinct and not enough by choice.
And if I just coming in behind Bill, Adrian, to comment on the question of improving your approach in mediation. I do think we've had, when we were starting with Jim, actually, and something I've become very conscious of over a career in conflict, there are so many variables in how a situation evolves that you have to really be on your alert to make the best use and optimize the variables for the purpose of creating, positive momentum rather than negative momentum. Conflicts always spiral very easily out of control or in the wrong direction. So you just have to be a very sensitive diplomat and appreciate the different dynamics, including down to things like, simple as space. Are you going to bring the opposing team into a good room or a less good room in your building? Are you going to offer them a poor sandwich lunch, or are you going to give them, the partner's hot meal, or whatever the circumstances are? And generally, to do well, you need to think of, how can you support your opposition? I think one of the best little mantras from principled negotiation from Harvard was be hard on the problem, soft on the people. In other words, cultivate good relations with the mediator as well as the other party, but be firm and confident, where you think you have strengths. But probably the biggest thing to bear in mind is enter any of these situations with a real mindset of curiosity. Why are they feeling that? Why are they saying that? Where do they want to go? And that will really help you get into the proper mental attitude for making the most of that situation, rather than feeling I have to tell them, I have to disparage them, I have to show my contempt for their arguments. And none of that will really serve you very well in most circumstances, compared to, I would really like to find out. I'm having difficulty understanding that, but please tell me more. So I think for advisors, it's very good to get into more negotiation training, mediation training. All of that helps, build a real repertoire of awareness and insight and sensitivity to what really drives conversations in different directions, which is what mediation is all about.
Thank you, Carl. We're coming up to 7 o'clock. We've had some questions about the opening session, the plenary session. And this is always an intriguing area, I think, for everyone involved in mediation. I wonder if I could just quickly ask the panel, and we are, of course, trying to look at ways of improvement, of positive change for next time. Can you give us an example of a great opening session, even one that surprised you, maybe? This is totally unscripted, so we'll allow a little pause.
I'm very happy to chip in if I may. Yeah, actually, it was a great opening session, but it was primarily made by one intervention. It was a case where some baby food had contained poisoning, botulism, was consumed by a 6-month-old baby. She's still alive, but she's now, I think, about 19 or 20, but she has a mental age of about 18 months, I think, or 2 years, and always will have. So it was obviously a highly, highly emotive context. The insurer, someone I know quite well from other mediations, I spoke to him the night before and said, how are you going to address this? And he said, slightly cheekily, leave it to me, but I promise you I won't let you down, and wouldn't be drawn on what he was going to say. So slightly heart in mouth, I gave him the floor in the mediation once the claimants had spoken. And he said to everybody this, he said, we find ourselves, those of us on this side of the table and those of us on that side of the table, on the opposite side of a whole group of issues. But we have one thing in common, and that is that most of us around the table are parents. And I just want to say to you, before I get into the legal issues, which are difficult, I just want to say to you, parent to parent, that I am unbelievably impressed with how you have dealt with this. And if we can do anything within the bounds of the difficult legal issues that we face, then we will do. And so what he did was establish a connection. From that moment, the case was resolved because he had chosen to recognize the differences, but also very overtly recognize a commonality. And he did it with immense grace as well, which helped. But yes, that would be one that sticks in the mind.
Great.
Yeah, I would echo Bill's kind of experience back to being hard on the problem but soft on the people. If you can really give your messages of or signals of empathy, it makes a huge difference in opening sessions. But the other question for lawyers is, imagine this is a joint working session, forget about it being the opening. What would you find most useful for having a conversation together? And then the third sort of very surprising opening session that worked very well for me was having had the two legal sides in a construction dispute put their best artillery out for an hour of how they would fight the other side, etc. I could see the two business people were both very enthusiastic entrepreneurs. They were getting impatient because they were used to control, and here they were listening to their legal teams, battling for them. But actually, they were feeling quite uncomfortable personally. I could see that actually they wanted to be in control. So I ended the opening session by saying, well, can everyone leave now except, and I picked the two MDs out and said, just stay with me. And it immediately led to the most frank conversation I've ever had in an opening session, because I could see they were so frustrated by what they'd gone through. Actually, they wanted to release their real feelings about the dispute and about each other and about the legal teams. So we had a good hour of really frank and positive and constructive negotiation exchange.
Can I just add one 15-second comment on Carl's point, which is that it's an example of taking risks as a mediator. And this business about fear of taking risks, and fear generally applies just as much to mediators as it does to the parties. So that's kind of a lovely example, Carl, of going out on a limb, doing something because it just seems the right thing to do, and you live with the consequences, good, bad, or ugly.
And I suppose to echo that point, however well you prepare for a joint session, either as a mediator or as a party, you can't always predict how somebody else is going to act. So I had a different mediation with a bank and two defendants. And the husband remained completely quiet throughout the whole joint session. He was quite poorly. So he'd nominated his wife to speak effectively for him, because he was really the sole borrower. And she she described herself as a housewife who didn't really understand this kind of thing. But she took the bank through all the points that they wanted to make, and then she went, right, well, we're here to try and settle, so this is what I propose. And she came out with a very detailed, very well thought out proposal for settlement. The bank's chins nearly hit the table because they absolutely were not expecting nor had prepared for this. These claimants were not legally represented. So although we talked about mediation, I talked to them about mediation generally, they didn't have anybody kind of in their ear telling them how it normally happens. And the bank went away, and the husband turned around to the wife and said, "What on earth did you do that for? I can't believe you just did that. You've completely ruined the whole thing." And she just looked at him and she went, "Well, my mother said to me that when you want to touch your nose, you go like that, you go like that." And well, that was just fantastic. And actually, it was really interesting because by doing that, she actually took control of the whole process on the day, because she had provided the skeleton structure and kind of taken control of the situation. And it was an amazingly good tactical move.
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, hasn't this been a really interesting session? I'm really thankful to our panelists. Just before we go, maybe I should give Jim a chance, if he would like to mark us. How are we doing? It's not your world, I understand commercial mediation, but we are working within your world. Is there anything that particularly stands out from what you've just heard about that you'd like to just remark on?
Yeah, I think one thing that strikes me is that there are very different, the psychological realm and the legal realm are very different. And coming back to something Rebecca said about apology and the nature of apology. Clearly in a legal context, to offer an apology in some way implies you're accepting liability. But in a psychological sense, sometimes if somebody feels aggrieved or wronged, it's the only thing that will heal their damage. To feel that somebody acknowledges damage was done and they understand what that harm and hurt was to you, that they acknowledge, I'm sorry that that's happened. I did that. What can I do to make it right? So acknowledging that damage was done and accepting responsibility for it and showing willingness to make some kind of amends. That sometimes is the only thing that'll stop someone's grievance. And sometimes it's not possible. And I understand it's got all kinds of legal implications if you're acknowledging liability. But people will go on lifelong campaigns to get justice if somebody won't apologize. They want someone to genuinely understand and apologize. And I think that's come out through actually things that each one of the other panelists have said, that understanding of these kind of basics of human nature and why people get into conflict. So it's been really interesting.
Thank you, Jim. Ordinarily, I'd now be inviting you for drinks and discussions over drinks. Unfortunately, we can't do that, but you know that only too well by now. But you know who we are, you know where we are, and please do get in touch if you've got any further questions or just comments. And we've had a couple of questions about whether any written material is going to become available, and we'll follow that up and see what we can do, if that's all right. But meanwhile, thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Been so many of you, and thank you for your kind comments, which are streaming through actually at the moment. And good night.
Good night.